Hello friends, followers and channel members, welcome to another video here in Microsoft's Flight Simulator. Well, with winter now upon us, I thought it was about time we had a good look at winter operations in the Airbus A320. So in its simplest form, I'm going to try and take you through everything that we need to do to successfully pilot the A320 when we're in cold weather. Now, I'm sure that most of you will already be aware that the aircraft's performance is certified on the basis of a clean wing, and with cold weather we get ice, and the ice can affect the smooth airflow over the wing, which decreases the aircraft's overall performance and leads to potentially stalling at a lower angle of attack than normal. So it's very, very important that we keep these wings nice and clear. Ice accumulation as well can also form on the static, pitot and angle of attack probes on the A320 and any other aircraft. So again, it's something that we need to consider, because if we lose information provided by these, then we may get unreliable air data during the takeoff and climb phases. In very cold weather, the IRS alignment may also take longer than usual. In fact, in some instances, it can even take up to 15 minutes. To make sure that the pitot tubes aren't full of ice and you want to get those unblocked, make sure you turn on the probe window heat. Now, normally this is automatic, and it will be once the engines are started, but when you're sat on the ground with no engines running, turn that on to make sure they're clear of ice. Now, of course, if ice accumulation is present on the wings and you decide that you're going to need de-icing, if you use GSX, this is a possibility. Of course, there are things we need to do inside the flight deck before we can actually de-ice safely. There are 4 types of de-icing fluid, and whilst they don't particularly mean anything in terms of difference in Microsoft Flight Simulator, it's worth noting that, just for quick reference, de-icing fluid type number 1 is the one that will quickly de-ice your aircraft before you go. 2, 3 and 4 have a longer time span and is also preventative. So this is the one that you would use if you were expecting a long taxi to the runway or being held up by ground traffic. Now, before de-icing can commence and the fluid starts spraying, there are a few things that we need to do. First of all, engines and the APU can either be stopped or running during de-icing, but you cannot start the engines during the fluid spraying. In the flight deck then, we need to check that the cabin pressure mode selector is set to auto, which usually it is by default anyway. Engine 1 bleed and engine 2 bleed both need to be turned off. If both engines are running when you do this, you will get an ECAM warning when you set the push buttons to off. If this occurs, of course, we can just disregard that. The APU bleed also needs to be turned off, and then we need to find the ditching push button and turn that on. Doing this ensures that the outflow valve, the pack valves, the avionic ventilation inlet and extract valves all close to prevent de-icing fluid from entering the aircraft. Once that's all done, then de-icing can commence. The time that the de-icing starts needs to be noted. If you're using type 1, this is a low viscosity and it has a limited holdover time, so it's mainly used just for de-icing. Types 2, 3 and 4 are more viscous, so they have a longer holdover time, and it's not just used for de-icing but also, importantly, anti-icing. 1 minute after the completion of spraying, engine 1 bleed and engine 2 can both come back on. 5 minutes needs to pass, however, before you're able to turn on the APU bleed, and that's because there is a risk of de-icing fluid ingestion by the APU air intake. So keep the APU running, but don't turn on the APU bleed until at least 5 minutes after spraying has been completed. From this point on then, normal operations can resume. It's worth noting in the taxi, however, that if it is contaminated, a couple of things to take into consideration. Number 1, if it's a contaminated runway, then you are going to by default be using toga and not flex. You are also not going to be able to do a single engine taxi, as both engines need to be started and running if the taxiways are also contaminated. During the after engine start flows, note that we don't set the flaps at this point. We leave the flaps retracted until we're about to turn onto the runway. This, of course, can cause an alert if you press the takeoff config button. With the ground contaminated, the taxi speed should be limited to 10 knots. Any actions as well that you would normally do which may distract the pilots during the taxi, such as running checklists, etc., should only be done when the aircraft is stopped. On slippery taxiways, you may find it more effective to use differential braking and thrust instead of the nose wheel steering. Now, I actually found this to be true also in Microsoft Flight Simulator, so I think when there are freezing conditions, some of this seems to be modelled, or at least the Phoenix aircraft represented it well. Let me know how you get on in the comments below. Let me know how you found cold weather operations with regards to the handling on the ground of your aircraft. In icing conditions when holding on the ground for an extended period of time, or if you sense engine vibration, then the thrust should be increased periodically and immediately before takeoff, and this is just to shed any ice. Put the thrust up to around 50%, hold it for 2 or 3 seconds using the toe brakes, and then just drop that back off. It's also worth noting, be careful where you do this. You don't want the backs of your engines to be facing the gate or a terminal, as obviously this could cause damage to those behind you. Don't forget, before you turn onto the runway, to set the flaps and slats. Once we're all happy and all the checklists have been run, everything is essentially just a normal takeoff. A reminder though that you will most likely be only allowed to use toga for the contaminated runways. Before applying the takeoff thrust, you should try and ensure that the nose wheel is straight, and if the aircraft does have a small tendency to deviate away from the runway centerline, then use the rudder pedal steering, not the tiller. For the flight itself, normal de-icing conditions apply depending on the temperature and when you're flying through visible moisture. When preparing to land at your destination in cold weather, the atmosphere differs from International Standard Atmosphere Conditions, or ISA conditions. The aircraft can give you a misleading barometric altitude, and in cold conditions will read higher than the aircraft actually is. This also becomes very important when selecting your minimum descent altitude on approach. Pilots can refer to a table like this one, where on the very top row is the elevation of your arrival destination, and down the left hand side is the reported temperature. So if, for example, we were landing at an airport that was 300 feet above the elevation of the altimeter setting source and the temperature was -10, then we would need to add 30 feet to our minimum descent altitude to compensate for the altitude discrepancy because of the cold weather. As you may not always have live air traffic control in Microsoft Flight Simulator, you'll perhaps also need to add this correction to the final approach fix platform altitude for your approach. For landing then, medium auto brake is selected. However, don't be too concerned if you don't get the auto brake light after touchdown, because if you are landing on a contaminated runway, then you may not decelerate as quick as normal, so it doesn't sense the deceleration like it would do under normal conditions. Maximum reverse thrust is selected when the main landing gear touches down, and it can also be used until the aircraft has come to a complete stop, unlike under normal operations where we'd normally deselect reverse thrust once we had reached 70 knots. After landing, don't retract the flaps, leave them because they will need to be inspected once we've arrived at the gate for ice accumulation buildup. This of course has to be done when the engines have been powered down, meaning that there's going to be a special procedure that we need to do in order to get the flaps retracted with no hydraulic pressure from the engines. To do this, start by turning the yellow electric pump to on, then check that the blue electric pump is on auto. This is by default, so shouldn't be an issue. Next, navigate to the blue pump on the overhead and turn this on. After that, you can then retract the slats and flaps. Monitor the retraction on the upper ECAM. So that's pretty much all the basic things you need to know about cold weather operations in the Airbus A320. Of course, these also apply to the A319 and Airbus A321. If you do have any questions following this video, then please do leave a comment down below and I'll do my best to be able to come back and answer those for you. Hope you found this video useful and informative. If you have, please do leave a like, and of course if you are new to the channel, then be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications bell so you don't miss future videos and of course our live streams. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all again in the next one. Bye bye for now.